Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea Tour is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, David Hayes, and Polar Inertia Journal, an outlet for artists and researchers documenting the urban condition at polarinertia.com. One of the most interesting things I read among the observations in your book, The Koreans, was this way that you had of getting into Korean culture, Korean attitudes, by looking at how they drive, their behavior on the roads. Can you still infer much about the Koreans based on how they behave on the roads today, 10 years later since the last edition?
Yeah, I did it a little bit tongue-in-cheek.
A lot of truth to it, I think.
There is, because the thing is that the point I was trying to make was that you can do a quick political analysis of politics and power relations in a country by looking at how people drive. Why? Because the automobile is the most powerful weapon behind the hands of most ordinary people, and how they use it, and how they organize themselves. Tells you a lot about society, and but you can only go so far with this sort of idea. But the answer to your question is, I think you can. I mean, I think you can tell a lot about all societies like this, and the distinction here in Korea is one of the interesting things about Korea is that it's a country where traditionally the law has been used to oppress people, and so the law is seen as a sort of a referee rather than as an arbiter of truth and fairness and justice as it is in, say, the States.
An abstraction to be adhered to.
Yes, exactly. And so what you see now compared to, say, 20 years ago is the driving is much more lawful than it used to be. For example, when there's a traffic light or pedestrian crossing or a junction, people stop at the red line, at the white line, which they didn't used to. They were always creeping over it, but they stop there now. Things like that. But at night time, it changes.
Adherence to the law changes based on the time of day.
Exactly.
Wow.
So at night, you need to be very careful. Cars will routinely go through red lights. See, again, a red light is not seen as something that is saying to you, stop.
It's not an absolute.
It's not an absolute. And that was because particularly not so long ago when the country was a military dictatorship, there was a lot more military activity on the street. The soldier directing the traffic had more authority than the lights. And if you want to see this, an example of this, the one place where this is still in evidence, is right in front of the presidential Blue House. There are traffic lights that are permanently red.
They never change. They never actually legally let you through.
Exactly. But there's a policeman there, presumably part of the presidential security, because he's dressed differently from a normal policeman, whose gesture of his hands or a wink of his eye lets you through. So you look at the man, not at the rule.
There's a lot of people looking at the man, not the rule, in all senses here in Korea.
Exactly. So you see that, and as a consequence, that sends a message that the red light is a sort of, it's not an absolute, it's kind of a relative, and so if there's no one else around, I'll go through it. And particularly taxis are very skilled at this. I mean, the driving is very skillful. It's not sloppy driving, very skillful, but it's very unlawful at night time, and consequently still dangerous. I mean, the traffic fatalities here are still very high.
This is one of the many fascinating observations you can read in The Koreans, Who They Are, What They Want, and Where Their Future Lies, the book by Michael Breen, my guest today, who is not only a writer, of course he's written other books as well on important figures North Korean and South Korean like Jong-il, and the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, but he's also the founder and chairman of Insight Communications Consultants, in whose office we're sitting today in Insadong, in Seoul, Korea, on Notebook on Cities and Culture. Now, this idea of how many deaths there are in Korea, it's come up in the news again in the wake of the Sewol sinking, which, when people hear this, will be months ago now. But tell me, this is a country that the standard narrative is it was in shambles, and then it became one of the most developed countries in the world very quickly. Between the 1950s and the 1990s, they'd gone from nothing to this almost vision of the future to a lot of the world. But now, the Sewol was not an isolated disaster. I mean, the Korean friends now of mine, they take this occasion to look back at all the disasters that preceded it: collapsing highways, collapsing department stores, other ferries sinking, airline crashes, and they're asking themselves, is this really a developed country? Is that a question in the air that you sense here in Korea?
Yes. I think this terrible sort of tragedy, the sinking of this ferry, with the loss of 300 primarily students, it really made Koreans put the handbrake on a little bit and stop and think. We've just got used to thinking of ourselves as a developed country. Foreigners have been telling us we're developed, and we didn't believe it, but now we do. And then this comes along. I mean, this was a third world accident.
Yes.
And I think the conclusion, quite correctly, is that, yes, Korea is very developed, particularly in the hardware side of things, less so in the software. It appears very developed. And for a lot of people coming from Europe and other places, it appears more developed than their own countries. But there are areas in which it is lagging behind, and that's just to be expected. I mean, the development you cited from the 50s to the 90s actually was it didn't start till the mid-60s.
Right, it wasn't day one. It wasn't just after the war they didn't start building.
Well, there was, after the war for 12 years, they were just sort of had the begging bowl out with the US government. It was, well, that's a bit unkind. I mean, it was reconstruction, but there wasn't purposeful development. That started around the mid-60s, and by 1980, the country had transformed. So it was a 15-year thing. Thereafter, it was just more of the same.
Right. And the early 80s was when you came in, right?
I came in 82, and this country struck me as pretty modern. I mean, it was a military dictatorship.
Right, there is that.
There was that. But the sort of the bow. I mean, the arrow had left the bow, so to speak. You know, that's a bad image, sort of a irrelevant image. But the bullet had left the gun. You know, it was on its way. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm not a specialist in development. I just sort of record what I see. But I dare say people who study this would be able to tell you that in a country, when a country develops economically, there are various ways to do it, and depending on how you do it, some things change and others don't. And it's interesting for me what takes longest to change. One reason why people from already developed countries, like American experts and European experts, are not very good at advising foreign governments, is that they don't realize, they're not able to accept certain thing. Like, I'm thinking here, I'm hesitating because I'm thinking of corruption. Corruption is not such a bad thing. You know, corruption in North Korea is what makes the place go round.
Right.
You know,
that's why they have a black market where sometimes people can buy food.
Corruption can be good. And as an evil, it's on a list. There are other things that maybe are more important. It's more important that a country has leadership that wants to develop than that those leaders don't sort of put a few dollars into their back pockets, you know? And so there comes a point when you have to address that corruption. And there's a lot of this type of shortcutting, building buildings with shoddy material and stuff like that. Yeah. And this is what and paying off of inspectors and things like that. And this is what lay behind this accident. The vessel was, I think, seriously overloaded. And they had added on decks. They'd overloaded it, and it was too high in the water. So when they took a sharp turn, the thing tipped over. You know, like a truck. You know, you suddenly do a right turn in a truck at 100 miles an hour, and it's going to go over. And it was a similar thing, and that's you know, because of corruption, also because safety training, safety manuals, safety is just an annoyance.
Yes, you know, it's slowing down this country's entry into the developed world.
Exactly. It's like, oh, you've got to spend time and money training all your employees. No, I haven't got time for that. I just want them to make money.
Right.
So the other thing is that the government didn't respond very well. The authorities didn't respond very well, but they're the ones tasked with improving that. So it remains to be seen how well they will do that, because the Korean government is actually, I mean, it may seem an astonishing thing to say, given that this is a developed country and extraordinary in many ways. But the government, in my opinion, the politics lags behind the quality of the people.
Yeah, I've heard more than one Korean friend say that the president of Samsung is obviously more important than the president.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And why that is, I mean, in updating my book, I'm trying to put my sort of mind to this, and I still don't know how to describe it or certainly what the explanation is. But this is not a country. There's something in the sort of the political culture that doesn't, in my opinion, throw up the best people to lead.
That's maybe not where the action is generally thought to be, is political leadership. You know, you're better off somewhere else. Is that maybe the idea?
Well, not necessarily, because you know, there's status in politics, and people tend to strive for status. I think it's something in the, like, here, I'll give you an example of something that happened in the past. One of the interesting things about the way Korea grew was they decided not to let every man and his dog form a company and sell something, but to focus on some big conglomerates. Those conglomerates, in order to get all the government funding that they needed, had to prove themselves in overseas markets. And then the local market was protected, tied up for them. They didn't have competition in the local market. They had to succeed. If they couldn't succeed in overseas sales, they didn't get the loans and all of that, and they didn't succeed.
So the idea was outside Korea, do well, and then inside Korea, yeah, we'll work that out for you.
Yeah. It can be shabby. But in other words, you have to prove yourself in something. So in politics, now I don't know about America, you know, a lot of Americans hearing me say this may think, well, you know, our system throws up a lot of idiots in politics as well. In the
sort of thinking along those lines.
In the British system, I mean, our system in Britain throws up a lot of elitists, right. But the crucial skill, because of the nature of Parliament, is they have to be able to speak.
Yes. That's very much less important in Korea.
Yeah. In Korea, it's not. So,
I've actually heard stories, you know, watching of Korean friends watching Park Chung-hee, the current president, meet with Obama, and she would say something in Korean in response to one of his questions, and they would just wonder, how is the translator going to translate the word salad? Our president just said that this meaningless verbiage. She just said, how will he translate this to English in a way that makes any sense at all? And that's what goes through their heads seeing their president speak here, evidently.
This Colin, I've seen it a lot over the years, where a president is in a situation like that, and my Korean friend, you know, watching the television is kind of cringing with embarrassment. It's like, oh God. Not with all presidents, right. But and the thing is that to succeed in Korean politics, you don't have to be able to speak well, you don't have to be articulate, you don't have to be an administrator, you don't have to have experience. But obviously you have to have a certain type of leadership. Now, in the past, that was determined by money. The opposition figures who are our sort of democratic heroes, Kim Dae-jung, Kim Yong-sam, these were the people who were able to secure funds, often illegally or secretly, so the government couldn't stop them, that kept them in their position. That was their skill. They were able to convince business people to give, however they did it, to give them money. There's no skill now. There's no skill required.
I see.
So, for example, we've got one presidential hopeful lined up who's an academic and a doctor and a businessman who started commenting on Korean politics and giving speeches that everybody suddenly agreed with. This is the new politics, the new age. And this man is now a joint leader of the opposition party, a potential presidential candidate with no experience, with no idea what he's like. Maybe a complete flake.
Oh, I see.
So the country, in some ways, leads itself. That's what I mean by that is the conglomerates do what they do regardless of who the president is. The
Samsung, the Daewoo, the Hyundai.
Hyundai, LG's, these big companies that now people are familiar with overseas. And the bureaucracy is extremely important. And the bureaucracy and the conglomerates, they kind of have to manage whoever's in the presidential Blue House. I don't mean control. They have to dodge and weave and deal with and maybe go quiet for the 5-year period that the person's in there, say, or whatever. Right. But one way or another, the country keeps going.
This reminds me of the central, if there was an argument, the central argument of you'll know probably the show Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, which aired back in your homeland. It's a show I like because, it frames politics in Britain as being essentially very, very similar, as the country is run by a permanent bureaucracy. The elected officials they think they're doing things, but, that's just the bureaucracy humoring them, essentially. And in America, I think the situation is not a million miles from that. Is there a sort of Yes Minister of Korea? Could there be such a show? Could that be satirized similarly, that same phenomenon? Is it a similar phenomenon?
You mean that the country runs under its own steam anyway?
Yeah, and the permanent bureaucracy is sort of in charge anyway. The elected officials are sort of, I don't know, figurehead seems even too much.
Well, yes and no. Because I hesitate, because for two reasons. One is that there's two aspects of this. One is that the people expect enormous things from the president. You notice this generally in a presidential system, because you don't have anything beyond it. You don't have.
Might as well be God, the president. Yeah.
You don't. I know in America you have the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't sort of eat fish and chips. It's a thing. It's a concept. Yeah. In Thailand, for example, you've always got the king there, so you've got governments rise and fall. But in this case, people are still expecting somehow, because it's not been articulated. The limitations of the democratic presidency haven't really been articulated, and people somehow still deep down want a Park Chung-hee. Yes. He was the leader who got Korea. He was the dictator who started Korea's economic miracle.
He's identified more than anything with the country being developed, with ordering it to develop, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. And son of a bitch, but our son of a bitch type of thing.
Yes, there's a whole generation here that seems like they're very much on the better the devil we know type idea, which I guess is what leads to Park Chung-hee's daughter being the president today, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think... it's extraordinary that Korea has a woman president, but it probably takes the princess, if you like, to be the first one. Now the door's open. Now we can have a woman president without even thinking anything about it. But there needed to be that connection because all the conservative old men voted for her, thinking of her father.
Yes.
But people sort of expect the president to be able to do a lot more than they can, and then get disappointed very quickly when they can't. The other
Very
thing,
similar to America in that regard.
I think so, but I think there's a bit more realism in America.
There's more cynicism, certainly.
Cynicism. Well, that's yes. Well, no, that's important.
Yeah.
And cynicism equals realism in that sense. In other words, that people aren't deluding themselves too much, and you're also able to laugh. You know, you got all the comedy shows, and people laugh at politics. They don't do that so much here. Take it a bit seriously. But the other side of it is that the president does have a lot of power, a lot of personnel. She's sort of the HR manager of the country, and you get a revolving door attitude to ministerial positions. So she's able to sort of interfere a lot, and each president is limited to one term of 5 years. The leadership in Korea, for whatever historical reasons, in all sectors, has a terrible habit of ignoring or undoing what their predecessors have done, and then putting their own stamp on things. So
because it was their predecessors, you just need to take that away.
It's not theirs. There is, for example, believe it or not, there is no long-term planning in South Korea for unification with North Korea.
Right. I've heard it's kind of not desired anyway.
Well, even so, I mean that's an option to not have it, to avoid it. How do we avoid it? Nobody's planning it. Now some academic can call in and say that's not true. I've got a paper here. Okay, very good, congratulations. But your paper doesn't mean anything, and it's not. So if something would happen in North Korea, some serious instability, we'd be winging it here. We wouldn't be blowing the dust off a blueprint and saying, look, we've done exercises and simulations on this before. We know what we're doing. Our long-term plan is for X. There is no long-term planning, and there's very little. I mean, there's a 10-year land use plan and things like that, which countries do. There's very little long-term planning because presidents have no interest, very little interest, in what goes on after their 5 years. They want everything to be within their 5 years.
One term, that's it, and there you have it.
Shot. Yeah. And there's not a lot of party loyalty, so you're not really thinking, well, I'll step down 5 years from now and then our party will continue. You don't care. In fact, your rivals in your own party may be a bigger challenge for you than the opposition. So, and parties come and go, so it's not like the Democrats and Republicans have been around for ages. It's, they get new names all the time, new configurations. The president, in some sense, does sort of dance on top of the elephant, if you like, and if she falls off, it doesn't matter too much. But in another sense, there is quite a bit of authority there, and there's great expectation. There's huge expectation for the good and moral use of power, and this is what disappoints. She doesn't have the power that people think she does, but people really want righteous leadership. There's a real yearning for that, and that's another thing they're not getting.
Now, as you say, you came here in 1982, which gives you a longer view than I think any other Westerner I'll be talking to on this show of South Korea. But 1982 was before South Korea had achieved the democracy it has today, and it was only a couple of years after the successor of Park Chung-hee, the dictator that followed him, essentially ordered Gwangju set fire to. That was, in 1980? You were there in 1982. Did you arrive here knowing this was the kind of country where that happened, where a dictator could just destroy a city and keep the rest of the country from knowing about it?
You ask an interesting question. I mean, personally, very interesting question, because I'm ashamed to say I came here completely ignorant. I mean, I knew it wasn't North Korea, and I knew there was a North Korea. And
you were glad this was not North Korea.
I was happy about that because I was a kind of, in my younger days, I was a one-issue conservative. In other words, I was conservative on the issue of communism. I thought communism was an abomination, and the rest of it, the conservative issues, I didn't care about so much. I was a bit liberal on other stuff, but that...
You were not a social conservative, but you were an anti-communist conservative.
I was an anti-communist. I mean, I didn't call myself an anti-communist because that was a bit unfashionable. But I was an anti-communist. I was conservative in the sense I was anti-communist, and I was liberal on pretty much everything else. Like I believe in democracy, which was but looking back, I'm astonished about how ignorant I was and unprepared I was for journalism. I came here because my wife had happened to teach here. And
so you had no interest pre-existing in South Korea?
No, I had very little knowledge, very little interest, and I wasn't even very well trained. I mean, I studied English literature and linguistics at university, which are, frankly, don't say this out loud, but pretty useless subjects unless you want to teach them.
Sure.
And I didn't know anything. I mean, I remember the first time I wrote a story about the economy, having to tell myself that exports means going out. As literally I didn't...
Write it on a card and just consult the card.
So now I say this, just to be honest, but it also meant I was a bit of a blank sheet. And I could sort of assess what I saw happening in front of me without any sort of theoretical background, anything like that.
You were not being shaped by some frameworks you had learned in school.
Not at all. And I wasn't that shaped by even attitudes of journalists, which are sort of negative about everything. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish, the negative. So I found myself when it's a funny thing because I think a little experience I had was 7 years later I got an opportunity to go to North Korea, and I went to talk with a friend of mine who was one of the ambassadors here, who was a bit of a Bolshevik, and asked him for advice. What do you think I should be looking for up there and stuff like that? And he asked me a very interesting question. He said, how prejudiced do you think you are against North Korea?
It's a difficult question to answer.
By virtue of having lived in South Korea for so long. And that got me reflecting. I realized I had absorbed some attitudes. I remember thinking when the police... there was a case when some police sort of assaulted some journalists at a demo or something. I remember actually thinking, those journalists really annoyed those policemen. They were just doing their job. I was realized that I had absorbed the way that this is how Koreans thought, even anti-government Koreans. They didn't think free speech is a right. It's an absolute. We don't have it, we need it. So when I say I was a blank sheet, I kind of learned democratic value. I mean, obviously I was an adult and I'd absorbed from my own country. I mean, I don't want to overstate this. But I was sort of learning it as I went along. And then I saw the Korean struggle for democracy and rights. And it appeared to me like a miracle. Because I saw the thinking, my own thinking, and the thinking of people around me transform. People were kind of liberated into a new way of accepting the political organization of their society and their respect for other people and their rights and that sort of thing. It was no longer a scruffy place where the strong survived. It was a place where people expected fairness and things like that. That was the beginning of it. So yeah, of course, the thought that a dictator can order troops to kind of shoot, to kill people, that it was horrible, and it was actually a horrible mistake. But you could see, living in Korea in those days, you could see where the thinking came from. It wasn't like a random brute appeared in charge. That's the delusion, you see. These dictators are not random brutes. They're thrown up by a system. They are not that different from anybody else.
Yes.
We, having grown up in democratic systems, we take it for granted. But in many ways, democracy is the more difficult and more natural state of affairs. It's far more natural in the ordering of human affairs for some to have more power than others, and for those people then to control the others. So, the old royal families of Europe, or the church, or tribal leaders, warlords, you name it. That's, human history is the story of those people in many ways. So the particular Korean circumstance was, there was no history of democracy, but South Korea was an American ally, and so could have been democratic. And also South Korea, when the Americans came in at the end of World War II, South Korea had been part of Japan.
Right.
Unfortunately, or maybe I shouldn't say unfortunately, but South Korea was not treated like a defeated enemy. The defeated enemies, Germany and Japan, were democratized by the Americans, basically. Whereas South Korea was just helped. Not quite true, because for the first 3 years, there was an American government that actually ran the place. But when they pulled out, and thereafter, it was a separate country that was an ally, very close ally, and very dominated in many ways, but left to its own devices. And the culture and the social culture, political culture, was authoritarian. So it was natural that people would look to a dictator. They didn't want the king back, but they wanted a dictator. And the justification for that, for strong dictatorship, was the presence of North Korea and the threat of a repeat attack. So the dictator was tasked with protecting the country. When Park Chung-hee was killed at the end of the 70s, there was a great moment then. They call it the Seoul Spring. There was a great opportunity then for a democratic election. But what happened was that, people came out in the streets, as they always did in those days, in their hundreds of thousands.
Many of the articles about Korea from those days are just about giant protests.
Exactly. It's just massive protest. The military got nervous because we're in the what you might call the Confucian's part of the world, where order is very highly valued, and a disruption in order, including natural, even a lot of natural disasters, are seen as a sort of a sign of something undesirable. So the instinct for order is very deep, and democracy is very noisy and ugly. And the military leaders there, and there's all these people out in the street clamoring for this, that, and the other, weren't. They were very nervous. There was also something unfortunate went on within the military where there's a generational change. And so those things kind of combined, and the dictator Chun Doo-hwan, who became dictator, he took his opportunity in a staged coup. First stage was he took control of the military, and second stage took control of the country. And in the process, the introducing martial law, very, very unfortunately, used special forces in two locations, Gwangju and at Seoul National University, to do essentially what was a police job, stop the students protesting. Those protests stopped in Seoul, but in Gwangju, the treatment of protesters by the soldiers was so horrible that the citizenry erupted in revolt. And actually the taxi drivers of Gwangju drove out the military out of the city in a brilliant maneuver where they blocked all the streets.
You don't think of taxi drivers as being that organized normally, but there you have it.
Brilliant. Koreans organize well. Yeah. They're instinctively, you get 3 or more Koreans together, they will have formed a couple of organizations. And then, obviously the country then sort of fell into rebel hands, so to speak, and sort of had to, not the country, the city. And the other units of the military came and took it back. And within Gwangju itself, the moderates who proposed to negotiate and discuss, because, they weren't rebels really, they were just outraged citizens, they got shouted down by more extreme elements, the hotheads, and so the thing all ended in a very ugly way.
The first person I interviewed, the first Korean I interviewed here, was born in Gwangju in 1980. So while in the womb, his parents were trying to stay away from where battles were going on. And he was telling me how relatives would walk across the country to Gwangju because the government kept any transit from going there with the story that it's dangerous to go to Gwangju, so we're going to keep you from going. Which I don't see that happening in another country. People actually walking across a country to a city to check if relatives are okay. It's only a country the size of Indiana, but the idea of walking across Indiana, it seems impossible to me. What does that tell you about a society like Korea?
If we were talking about North Korea, you wouldn't walk across the country to check on your relatives if you thought that there was a political situation going on, because you know how ruthless the authorities can be. In South Korea, though, soldiers are just young men doing military service, and I've seen outraged housewives berate an entire platoon of soldiers on the street, and sort of hit them with the handbags.
These are guys who have to spend a year and a half in the military, not 15 years or whatever it is in the north.
Well, it's 2 now. It used to be 2. It used to be more. It used to be 2.5 or 3. But not like in North Korea, it's 10 years. And so, because communications were all down, I think, I hadn't heard that people actually walked those distances. But I know that people were trying to get into the city, and they passed people who were coming out and told them what was going on. I also know that, give an idea of Korean passions and a sense of outrage in the citizenry. I know one of my friends, her parents pushed her brother into his bedroom and nailed the door shut with put wooden planks across the door and nailed it shut so he wouldn't go out and join the protest because it was so lethal. They were killing people. They were clubbing people to death. And the citizenry was so outraged. Instead of being cowed, they were furious. And then, that fury was very dangerous. Young people, like high school students, people like that, were the main victims. So,
when you got here, it was 2 years after that. It was 30 years or so after the Korean War. If you go from the beginning of the 50s to the early 80s. So tell me, did it feel like coming to a country we would think of today as a repressive dictatorship? What did Korea feel like at that time?
It did. No, that's the interesting thing. A dictatorship is. I've been to North Korea. There's probably no more thorough dictatorship in human history that infects everything. The South Korean dictatorships, or I think what we classify as the authoritarian countries, give off a very, very different vibe. In North Korea, for example, I remember the first day I was in the capital, Pyongyang, walking with a friend, a photographer, and he stopped me and he said, "Listen, there were a lot of people about." He said, "What can you hear?" I said, not a lot. And I thought he was trying to give me the no traffic metaphor, you know. And he said, you can hear people's feet on the pavement. It's the dominant sound. They're not, and we both came from South Korea. They're not even talking to each other. In South Korea, by comparison, the streets were very lively. The Koreans, as you know, from LA, they're very noisy people, very outgoing. There's a lot of shouting. You know, when there's a group of kids together, they're sort of yelling and kicking each other. There's grandmothers sort of cackling away and laughing, and men shouting. It's a very noisy kind of environment. And you know, in Seoul, you add in the jackhammers and the commercial traffic and all of that. It's the decibel level is very, very high.
It's just white noise at a certain point. Yes.
And automobile drive and truck drivers whose hands are surgically attached to the horn.
Sure.
You just get this very, very noisy, lively, vibrant environment. And so the dictatorship makes itself known in what for many people is a very small part of their life, which is if they step into talking about North Korea or government policy on North Korea, criticizing the government's relationship with the United States or something, bang, then you're in trouble.
Here?
In South Korea. Not now. I mean, this is old South Korea. So you could, I remember being sort of indirectly threatened by American military and business people who considered the fact that I was writing for an American newspaper about demos and politics as I was just some kind of pesky, annoying person, a troublemaker, and I'm going to get into trouble. There's sort of an indirect, you better watch your step, as if to say, you know, you shouldn't be doing this, you're just annoying it. And I can see why they think that, because in their experience, this dictatorship, this is just what the Koreans were. It's like, you know, the British have a queen, so what? Get over it. And it impacted, it had very little impact on their lives and on the lives of the Koreans they saw around them. But they were wrong, because it was the fundamental structural flaw in the country. You know, and journalism's job is to keep poking away at it. You know. So they were wrong, but I could understand why they felt that way. It didn't, you know. So everybody there was relative freedom, and then suddenly there was unfreedom. You know, suddenly, like, you're not allowed to travel out of Korea unless you're a student who's been accepted overseas or you're on a business. You know, you can't go on vacation to Bali.
Right, you'll be going to Jeju Island every time.
That happened. That restriction was lifted in '89 after the first democratic election. You can't read. You can't read a proper newspaper. I remember getting. I used to read. There's two English papers still around: Korea Times and Korea Herald, and you'd see a small article on the back page, about 3 lines. 10 students held after meeting on so-and-so campus.
In a particular language.
Yeah, and you knew there'd been a massive demo because you'd smelt the tear gas coming over.
Right.
But so you didn't have the freedom, you didn't have the free press, and so you didn't have that freedom of knowing exactly what was going on in your country. You talk in coffee shops. The Koreans love the coffee. It's the world's biggest coffee drinking country, yes. I think.
Certainly the coffee culture is quite robust now, and I've been enjoying it.
Yeah. I mean, I could throw a stone and hit 3 Starbuckses from where I am now.
In any direction.
Yeah. And in the old days, it used to be a different type of coffee shop. They were basement coffee shops serving coffee mix.
So this the tabang?
The tabang, with the what do you call it? The artificial milk and the powder milk and the sugar.
That's why everybody orders Americanos here, isn't it? Because you might get that if you don't say Americano.
Yeah. And often, I mean, and school children weren't allowed in them because often you were served by waitresses and they were often a little bit dodgy sort of places. But, you know, everyone in Seoul no one took sandwiches to work or, you know, or rice to work. You go into, you slurp your noodles, or have your rice very quickly without talking with your colleagues, and you pile into a coffee shop for the last 45 minutes of your hour break. And then you become aware, particularly as a foreigner and as a journalist, I become aware of people straining to hear what I'm talking about. That was another sign of dictatorship. We didn't talk on the phone. I never interviewed people by phone. People talked obliquely on the phone because you assumed, rightly or wrongly, that it might be listened to.
You did your interviews on a crowded street where no one could quite hear you.
Well, it wasn't that bad. Wasn't that bad. It's just you.
Soviet Russia.
Yeah. You did it face to face.
Yeah.
You know.
I see.
I shouldn't say it in this way, but you know, the dictatorship wasn't that bad.
It wasn't as bad as some dictators we think of in history. The history of dictators. Yes.
Until you step into politics, and then you get very, very harshly and unfairly treated. And the thing is, because Koreans weren't aware of rights as a concept, they often took the treatment they got. I remember talking to one opposition politician once. He became a very close friend. He was Kim Dae-jung's sort of top man. And I met him when he came out of jail. And he... Finally, he told me one time, I said, what did they do to you when you got arrested? This was during the Gwangju time, he got arrested. You know, and he kind of laughed. Oh, you know, I said, well, did they hurt you? He said, well, a bit, yeah. Well, what did they do? They hung him upside down and beat the soles of his feet. But he wasn't outraged that they're not allowed to do this. Right. It's kind of like being at school, being bullied by somebody. It's like, this is just life. You know, those bastards are out there.
Who's going to stop it? Yeah.
Exactly. Right. But for people who didn't step into that area, the non-political types, people who kept their mouths shut about North Korea. North Korea was always a dodgy area. Only the intelligence agency and the presidential office were allowed to talk about that. I remember once, this was before I came, but hearing about a bunch of stamp collectors got arrested because they were allowed out. They went to an international
arrest in America usually
international stamp fair, and they'd bought some North Korean stamps. You know, so for the stupidest reasons, anything to do with North Korea, you could get arrested.
It's this experience I've had here in South Korea. I mean, I'm not exactly looking up, you know, the websites of the North Korean Sympathizers Association or whatever, but I just randomly hit that internet warning you get. The KCSC, is that the name of it?
Yeah.
And I can't figure out what leads to that, but I just occasionally get it. And I think, oh, I get this vibe, oh, it's still Park Chung-hee's country in some sense. I mean, that's of course an exaggeration, but does that feeling resonate with you at all?
Yeah, it's still, this is another mark, in my opinion, another example, in my opinion, of where the advanced nation isn't completely advanced. The Korean authorities do not trust their own people well enough to make their own judgments about North Korea.
Do they think they're going to defect to the North? I mean, I can't even imagine.
They think that people will, or enough people to be dangerous, will believe the North Korean propaganda. It's like, I mean, imagine if in America you know, this problem of homegrown Muslim terrorists, you know, one solution to that is to ban Islam. And ban talk of Islam and block, so that nobody gets exposed to the mullahs who are the hate preachers. Now in America you can't do that, but the equivalent is done here. Now, you know, let's be a little bit understanding. You know, North Korea is not some remote country. You know, this is like Nazi Germany right on your border. So the consequences of a third column within your country are unthinkable. And when you look at how in the war on terror, you look at how the country reacted to September 11, the suspension of rights, that America now tortures people and stuff like that. You can see that, imagine Canada was a virulently Islamic country bent on the destruction of America. Would we still be, would we be complaining about some websites being blocked?
Right.
But people do.
Perspective. Yeah.
People do, because North Korea is not really, North Korea is a military threat and a potential disruptive element, but it's not that visceral, it's not that ideological threat that it was. Right. So the irony is that the reason North Korea was threatening, the reason that young people might have accepted North Korean propaganda and become pro-North Korean was because they would be reacting against dictatorship. And that's exactly what happened in the 80s. You got, and I know I've got one or two friends now who are sort of pushing 50, who were pro-North Korean underground activists, and now look back and think...
Thinking that it was less of a dictatorship?
Thinking it was... well, they were both dictatorships, this is the thing.
Yes, one or the other.
And thinking that, in other words, they didn't think so liberal democracy was the way to go. They thought Korean nationalism was the way to go, and the North Korean version was more pure.
I do sense, I really don't want to overstate this, but I do sense there's not an admiration in some quarters of North Korea, but a sense like maybe they took the moral high road.
Yeah. No, definitely. There's a very strong, very pronounced streak of thinking in the left in Korea, the intellectual left, that North Korea has the moral high ground. Why? Because they didn't allow themselves to be, or they didn't kowtow to foreign power. The great irony is they did.
Right, they're dependent on foreign countries.
And they were right from the beginning. Kim Il-sung went over to the Russian embassy and got his marching orders. But the posture of the North Korean regime was up yours, foreigner.
yes, and so it remains.
Yeah, and that is, and also they purged people who collaborated with the Japanese who ruled the country for 50 years or 40 years before that. Whereas the South Koreans, under American rule, didn't purge collaborators. In fact, they employed them. They needed their skills, so there wasn't a purging, there wasn't a reckoning, and that's the issue over which people think that North Korea is more pure. But I haven't sort of updated myself with these folk, and what I've just described is 10 years old. Now, whether there's people out there still thinking that, now that North Korea's gone to the third generation dictator, I'm not sure. See, the thing is that a lot of South Koreans who started to think that way didn't believe everything their government told them about North Korea because they knew their own government was a dictatorship.
Right.
And sort of short on the truth. The irony was, what it said about North Korea was spot on. That's the irony.
You're actually correct.
Yeah. Yes. North Korea now is, it's not even a joke among South Koreans. They just airbrush it out of their thinking. They're just sort of, it's irrelevant. It's like if they travel overseas and people make jokes, are you from the north or the south? It's just embarrassing.
First thing you always see. The less someone knows about Korea, the more likely they are to ask north or south about any given Korean issue.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the significant disruptions Korea has endured over the past less than 100 years, over the past 60 years, 70 years. And since you write about the Koreans, you write about Korean culture, I'll put this question to you, because reading so much about it, I always wonder, there's the issue of when you're getting taught about, say, Native American culture in the United States, there's always the inkling that, how do I know, how was any of this ever preserved? Because it was eradicated to such an extent that, like, you wonder how much what you're getting is true, how much is assumption of what, the Native Americans were like. With so much, South Koreans seem to take pains to describe Korean culture as an unbroken culture, as this thread that, goes to the three kingdoms or what have you up till now. But it seems like, the Japanese colonial period alone essentially converted the place into Japan for a while, did it not? How much of a single story really is Korea at this point? It's, you hear one thing, but it's hard not to believe that there's a lot of gaps that are that are not papered over, but like the story is much more fragmented than you especially hear from South Koreans, right?
Yeah, and I think, if we could, the truth of the matter is we don't know. Well, what is culture?
Right.
There's
that complicated question.
The way I see culture is not so much the dancing and the painting. Right. It's what did people live like? What did they think like? What were their relationships like? And we have no idea what it was like 100 years ago in South Korea. And if there's any romance for that, it's not a realistic romance. It's a kind of a nationalistic, it's nationalism, and like with most countries, you sort of you forgive the past. Unless you've got in Prague, I went to this horrendous museum of torture, then it's bad. But if you're going to a royal palace or a grandiose cathedral, you're not thinking of the injustice at the time,
right?
The lack of democracy and all of that. So you're allowed to sort of modernize the past in that way. So I think that's what Koreans are doing. The fact of the matter is that in the Japanese period, the Japanese came in just at the turn of the 20th century and were routed at the end of World War II. In that 40 years, there was a social revolution here, because Korea was unified at that point. Korea was betrayed or let down by its aristocracy. They were useless.
Aristocracies often are.
Yeah. And it was I should say, old Korea, and not so old, was a caste society. The gradings of people were as strict as that. Mm-hmm. And in the end of going into the 20th century, there were even slaves. Although in theory they'd been freed. And the Japanese rule turned that around, So the heroes of modern Korea, the military dictator, the soldier, all poor boys, come from extremely poor families. These aren't the sort of, the silver spoon boys.
Yeah, still down.
The soldier, the merchant, the founders of Hyundai and these companies, dead poor people. They become soldiers, they become merchants. The soldiers and the merchants were among the scum in the old caste system. So you've had a social revolution, and with enormous American influence, which has been good. Korea has aspired to be a modern, technological society with all the values of a modern democracy, thanks to America. So the country we have today, there may be some romance about the past, but they don't want to be like the past.
Yes, the impression I get is of a very, very new country trying to draw connections between itself and the distant past, King Sejong and earlier, but without that sort of middle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there was a big gap in the middle.
Right.
And there's a lot of records there, because the courts kept thorough records. But I don't know how useful it is, because there's somehow in the teaching of history and the teaching of it all, something got lost. And the Koreans actually, for a while, adopted the Japanese view of Korea, which was it was a low-class, superstitious, rather sort of disgusting kind of place.
That's what it seems like every foreign writer here in that era wrote about the place too. All they would write about Seoul was how dirty they thought it was.
Yeah, and you know, I don't know what they're taught in school now here. I haven't sort of kept up on it, but when I first came here, like in the 80s, I'll give you an example. I had a friend who studied Confucianism, a British friend at a Korean university, and every day, you know, he'd fall into conversation with other students, and they'd say, "Oh, what are you studying?" And he'd say, "I'm studying Korean thought." And, but we don't have any thought, you know. So, you know, what does that mean? In other words, they had no idea of their own, in the philosophical area, of their own philosophical traditions.
Right. Abstraction remains not exactly priority one in Korea, right?
Right. But there are Korean historical scholars and thinkers and whatnot that merit study, but they didn't know that because A, the Japanese period, and B, the modern Koreans, the sort of the revolutionaries, if you like, also looked down on society with good reason. They wanted, you know, it's like the working class people who's, you know, they don't want to romantically remain working class or even, you know, peasant class. They want to become an advanced country. So why hold on to all this nonsense? You know, that was sort of a prevailing attitude.
Yeah, look at where it got us.
Yeah. But now that we're comfortable, now that we're sipping our Starbucks coffee and playing with our, you know, the most wired country in the world and all of that, let's show a bit of love for our ancestors. I think that's what's going on with the Korean culture.
Now, the first edition of your book, The Koreans, came out in 1998, right? Around late 90s, about 15 years after you got here. What was it that made you interested in the Korean people in that first sort of span between arrival and the first edition of The Koreans?
I think I like them. And for me, when I write, I've learned this because I wrote a book about the North Korean dictator, and I wasn't very pleased with it, and I promised myself I would never write again about somebody I couldn't admire. I liked the Koreans. And one reason I liked them is because they were, in my opinion, not judgmental people. They're very accepting people. Which is ironic because they appear conservative.
And they appear fairly harsh about each other.
They're really harsh about each other, but that didn't bother me. They weren't harsh about me.
Yes, that's true. About foreigners, they are.
Yeah. I should say that as a foreigner. I mean, I grew up, as a British kid, and British people, I don't know if it's the same in your part of the States, but British people are so scathing about each other. It's all, you get two guys sitting there and a third walks in and they'll nudge each other and say, look at him, look at what he's wearing, what's his, it's that kind of bitchy. So I kind of grew up in that world, and whereas I found the Koreans were just not like that. And when I started to learn a bit of Korean, and and the same is true with North Korea actually. When I was in North Korea, I didn't let on that I understood Korean, and I fully expected the guides and the drivers in the car to be making snide comments about us, the tourists, and giving us nicknames and things like that. They didn't. They never did. They weren't like that. If they were Brits, they would have been. They'd have had nicknames for every tourist.
No doubt. So you amuse yourself somehow.
I like them. Yeah. And when the niche, if you like. I want to tell the story. I was actually asked to write a business book. As part of it, there was a series. There was one on China and one on Japan, and both had been written by journalists. And they asked me if I'd do one on Korea, and I said, I'm not a business writer. I'm not going to write. I'll write about the Korean people, but I'm not going to write a business book. And they said, okay, fine. And the spot I tried to sort of hit was what I noticed. My journalist friends and academics at that time that I felt this may be a bit unfair, but it was just my sense of what I read. Foreigners analyzing or writing about Korea were all rather superior in their attitude.
In some way, they were still that early 20th century guy saying, "Look how dirty Seoul is. Look at these shamanistic people." In some regard.
Well, absolutely. It was just sort of an updated version of that. It was, and it happened at every stage of the development. When Korea announced it was going to go into electronics, all the clever people said, well, this is going to be a laugh, isn't it?
Or shipbuilding or whatever. It's like, yeah, sure, Korea's going to do it.
Would you go in a ship built by a Korean, like that? And I mean, it wasn't quite that bad. It was sort of an academic, a thoughtful version of that. I thought the reason for that wasn't sort of my country is better than yours. The reason is that the journalists and the writers and the academics and people like that writing about Korea tended to see the two parts of Korea that were the most unpleasant. One is the politics, and the other was the business and the corruption.
Ah, yes.
And the kind of abuse of people. They looked down on Korea because they didn't like Koreans.
What they knew of Koreans came from these institutions that are visible from a distance and very much sausage factories.
Exactly, yeah. That, and they probably had Korean wives who, used to beat them up and stuff like that. Sure. But, so I liked the Koreans, and so I wanted to be critical, like the journalist in me wanted to be critical, but at the same time to do it on a foundation of affection. And I like to think that I succeeded in that, and that I actually started a new trend. I like to think. I mean, I've never really tested it, but I've noticed since that this sort of looking down the nose thing started to thin out in popular writing.
You don't see it anymore.
You don't see it anymore now. You see, because Korea's cool. It wasn't then. It was distinctly uncool. And it's easy to talk up people you think are cool. It's much more difficult to talk up people who no one's backing. Right. So that's what I aimed at.
Right. In 1998, that was still a job to be done, to back the Koreans. The second edition and most recent date of the Koreans came out in 2004. Conveniently, the year after, I think about 2003, Korean film really hit in a big way in the world, and people started realizing what Korea was. It's about the time I did too. And 2004 to 2014, now 10 years have passed. You're working on a new edition of the Koreans. What has happened in that decade that made you realize it's time to revise this thing?
Well, it's because there's so much change, and the references and the anecdotes and incidents I describe and examples I give are all from a period when half the readers weren't born, there's only so much. You're looking at incidents in the 70s and 80s. It seems like ancient history for a lot of people. So that's. But there's such. I'm going to give you an example of the change. When I wrote the manuscript, I wrote the manuscript in '97. I gave it to a friend of mine. I was in England at the time, and I gave it to a friend of mine who was an editor. He was one, and this was a book where they didn't pay a massive advance, so they weren't going to thoroughly edit it. I had to make sure that
it was on you to do that.
And he had told me he did this. He when he did book editing jobs, he would edit backwards. Because the mistakes you make in editing is when you get caught up with the flow of the narrative. So he would edit backwards. He'd start the end of the book and read sentence by sentence. And so I paid him like a few £100 to say, would you do this for me?
Yes.
Which he did very kindly. And but then he sort of bit his lip. He had something he wanted to say, and I thought, oh, hello, oh, he doesn't like it. And he said, it's very negative.
Oh, so you were trying to do the opposite.
Yeah.
He thought, so you hear that, you're like, well, I somehow accomplished the exact wrong thing.
Yeah. And I said, really? And he said, from the little that I know, I think Korea has some culture and some attractive points. You don't mention the culture. And I thought, oh. So I added half a page on Korean culture. I mentioned one movie and some pop songs in a paragraph. Now, fast forward to today, and, Koreans are not just as individuals. I mean, it's swept out of Korea. Korean movies, and they're now collaborating with Hollywood movie makers, and Korean movies are very highly rated. The K-pop scene has astonished everybody, and it's hit an early teens market in particular, particularly with women, young girls. That is astonishing and made possible by YouTube and whatnot, and so on and so forth. This isn't just I never could find a quote, but I read somewhere that Winston Churchill once had said that, economics rides on the politics and culture rides on the economics or something. In other words, you need to have cash in a society to create culture that people are interested in. Otherwise, it's just sort of traditional dances, Morris dancing around the poles. And so I was always looking out for, okay, when this is going to happen. And it happened I didn't notice it, because it happened in places that I didn't look, it wasn't part of my life. And it took everybody by surprise that TV dramas, right now it's TV dramas, movies and pop music. And I think that's going to change. I think we're going to see singer-songwriters and some real originality, because, the K-pop stuff can only last so long.
Right.
So one way, and there'll be other things. There's a yearning for the Nobel Literature Prize, and my wife's best friend is the daughter of the man who's been put up for it every year, and because that yearning is there, I bet you Korea never gets that one. They'll suddenly get something else. Suddenly it'll pop up somewhere. So I need to try and capture this and convey that. And I also need to be speaking to an audience that's interested in Korea, reading about Korea for that reason, because they're familiar with this.
They already know something. They know they don't know nothing, as your readers did perhaps in 1998. Finally, despite all the explosion of development and of culture and of the sort of Korean soul searching lately, is this recognizably in any way the country you came to in 1982?
It is. I mean, it's, and I'm very, very interested in what develops, what doesn't develop, what develops quickly, what develops slowly, what develops at mid-speed. I'm fascinated by this.
It's never all the same. It's there's things that are more developed than the States here, much more, and things that are always subtler, always the things you don't think of that are maybe not as developed as the States or England.
And then, I start asking myself, as you just said, what's more developed? What can Korea teach the world? They don't even know they can teach it, but they can teach the world something. E-government is one.
The taxes are easier here.
Taxis.
Like paying taxes, I hear, you can do a lot more. For instance, on the internet here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Taxes.
Yeah.
I thought you said taxis.
Well, taxis too. You can pay with your subway card. Yeah. Get on that, America.
Yeah. Taxes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you're American. You're in the what history will look back on and see as the totalitarian dictatorship of tax, of, the IRS.
Yes.
And the IRS is a beast. And I think no other country has a tax regime that's as nasty as that. So, but the Koreans make it very simple.
Yeah.
Very simple. And forgiving. You're not going to get slammed in jail if you don't pay taxes. You just get a bit of time to pay. Sorry, we got off the point there. So what's different?
How is it? What is the same?
Okay, the language is the same, although that changes as well. Some of the buildings are the same, although most of them are new. People still like kimchi.
As do I. So hey.
It's in many ways, like when I first came here, there's a part of downtown Seoul near City Hall, Lotte Hotel, Plaza Hotel, Chosun Hotel. I spent my first 3 weeks here in the Lotte Hotel right downtown, then moved to an apartment, and my office was in that sort of small circle. And I remember it very well because this country, like Japan, or because of Japan, doesn't have street addresses, street names and numbers of houses. Therefore, everybody's confused all the time. Because God created the smartphone and GPS, we're now able to find a way around. But the amount of wasted time of people trying to find things, because only the real estate agents and the post office know what addresses mean.
Right. And everything's all come out of Anguk Station, exit 7, turn at the chicken shop, turn at the other chicken shop.
You go by landmarks, yeah. And to add to that confusion, if you go into the subways, at each corner before you come out, there'll be a map. But the top of it won't be north. Then one corner it'll be northeast, then it'll be southwest, then it'll be,
It's a painful lesson for any foreigner.
Yeah, so it's like blind man's buff, you're really spun around. So I gingerly walked from the hotel to the office and got familiar with the landmarks on the way, then expanded my sphere. Now that core area, there's been change. The Lotte Hotel's doubled in size, but fundamentally isn't that much different.
Fundamentally, somehow the same.
It's basically the same, very recognizable. There's a little bit newer bits, but it's not that when I came it was all Nissen huts and shacks and peasants, crouching in the doorway smoking long pipes or anything like that. It was pretty much as it is now. So there are places like that are familiar. As I say, the language and the kind of the courtesies of the people are familiar. Beyond that, and racially, people are similar. Although there's a biggest influx of foreigners in Korean history now. Although most of them are also Asian, so they sort of Chinese, Japanese, so they kind of blend in a bit. People sort of look the same. But apart from that, I would say everything has changed. And the Koreans themselves, they like this change. They seem to be a people, with a 5,000-year past. But they're not really. They don't care about that. They like change. They're in my opinion, they're the world's fastest early adapters. The idea that in a society, you bring something, Apple brings out something new. 100 people will queue up overnight to get it. But, your granny will, 5 years later, she'll let you teach her how to use it, sort of thing. And everyone else is in between. The Koreans, 99% of them are in the queue. Boom. Old, young, short, fat, thin. They're all big enthusiasts about new things.
Change is still good here. America has grown a bit ambivalent about it, and England, Lord knows, has a different attitude entirely.
Yeah, well, we, our glory days sort of hold us back in a way.
Yes. Ours too, now. Ours too.
Yeah, so, who knows what the future will hold. The people who, I'm not an expert really, I'm just a sort of a punter, but we foreign experts and commentators since Korea first announced its economic growth plans have been informing the world of why these aren't going to work. I notice people are now informing the world why Korea is actually going to collapse like Argentina or something, you know.
Any day now.
Yeah, any day. But it won't happen. And they'll find a way. And these are Dunkirk people, you know. They'll find a way. The ships will come out and rescue them, and they'll fight again. You know, they won't go back to what they were. There's one thing you can say about this country: it will never go down. They won't let it. You know, they will do whatever it takes.
So it doesn't matter if they're disasters. Doesn't matter if a dictator kills a lot of our own people. It doesn't matter. They stay here and keep going.
They'll keep going, and they will. I think they'll surprise us. You know, K-pop is a phenomena, but it's not a profound. The world isn't learning something, you know, like non-violent protests or something that it didn't know before. You know, It's not. Psy is fantastic, but he's not going to, you know, shake the world. But the Koreans will teach us something, and I think it's something to do with how to be vigorous and passionate at the same time as being liberal, as being containing all sorts, you know, sort of kind of a blend of ideas. This is where like philosophies, religions, all sort of mix up here. You literally get families where family members have different religions, and that's the place that religion should have. It should just be a private choice that you don't hit anybody else over the head with. The Koreans do that very, very well. They know exactly where it belongs. At the same time, they become the most fervent in their faith. Yes. You know, so it's how do you put those two things together? You know, that's something they'll teach us. The other thing they'll teach us is where does all this in modern democracy, this phenomena of mistrust of leadership, which is understandable and is good and is natural, but there's something unhealthy about it. But we're right to be suspicious of people who want to rule over us. The Koreans, I think, will take us to a place where those people are reduced to administrators. They'll take us to an online form of government and governance. I'm convinced of it.
If anybody can.
If anyone can, yeah. If anyone can, they'll take us there because they basically hate their leaders, and they always will.
Yes.
You know, this yearning for the great moral leader is never going to be fulfilled.
Right.
Because as soon as he or she comes along, they'll turn on him. You know?
Yes.
You know, when they find out she has a boyfriend or something, or God forbid a girlfriend. You know? I remember thinking this when I was writing the book all those years ago. What was it, 15 odd years ago? That they're in sort of mid-growth. I kind of had this idea that it was going to end at some point, and then now they've arrived. Now they're just going to be a normal country. But I think this is just something that's just going to keep going. You know, they're going to get hit. They've got issues already. They're going to get hit by the aging population. You've suddenly got this year, last year, and this year, the drop off in the population has suddenly hit the universities. So the top ones are okay. Everyone's clamoring to get into them, but all the rest are going to they haven't been prepared for it.
Given the number of universities in Seoul alone, they feel it.
Yeah, you've got hundreds of universities here. Well, 100, but
for one city, it's astonishing.
I don't know if there's that many in Seoul.
I could believe 40, 30 would be 20. Is that a huge amount?
So a lot of these are either going to collapse, or the solution is they're going to have to get foreign students coming in. Well, to get foreign students coming in, unless you're going to go for the impoverished market where standards are even lower than yours. You know, standards are not very high here, which is ironic. You're going to have to improve standards. So who knows? This country, in the end, they could become a big education centre. You know, they're just going to surprise us in the way that they find solutions to the challenges, but they will find them. They're not going to go down. You know.
I've been speaking here in Insadong, Seoul, Korea, with Michael Breen, author of The Koreans and books on specific Koreans, including Kim Jong-il and Sun Myung-moon. I have a problem saying that name for some reason. He has got new books on the way later in the year, or perhaps the year following, including the revision of The Koreans and a book with a North Korean defector. What's the title of that book?
The Girl in the Red Shoes.
There's more to watch for about Korea's North and South from Michael Breen. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to all the backers of Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea tour on Kickstarter. Adam Hartzell, Aidan Nullman, Alfred Lee, Andy Cooney, Angus Gordon, Bala Chenupati, Cam Smith, Chin Music Press, Dan Caraselli, Danny, Deborah Smith, Emmett Farragher, Umberto Grant, Ian Plosker, Ismail Kennedy, Jackie Gast, Jay Chang, Jeffrey Davis, James DeVito, Jonathan Filbert, Josh Paget, Kimberly Hahn, Manvir, Mark Hines, Matthew Workman, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Monica Eck, Michael Fransky, MJ Pritchett, Patrick O'Flaherty, Patrick Park, Piers Rippey, Robert Salzberg, Samuel Hansen, Sean Brown, Themistocles Crucis, Thomas Unterberger, Timothy Dobbs, and Wayne Wright.